Yeah, so anger, it's one of those things I believe that we all struggle with, whether I think we realize it, but it's one of those things like we've all dealt with it. And for me personally, I've never really thought through the source of anger. I always end up just kind of looking at the result, because we all know the result of anger in the sense of it's probably one of the most destructive things that can come from the human heart is anger, because it can completely tear down people. Like when we're in a moment of rage and in a moment of anger, like we can destroy people with our words, with what we say and do. I mean, we can destroy people emotionally, sometimes physical altercations, and spiritually. But the thing is, the more I kind of started thinking through this, was really trying to think through what's the source of anger, and where does it come from? Like, what is anger rooted in? And a couple of things that I kind of thought through and studied through some scripture on. And, one of them is that anger it comes from unresolved issues in the past. And so what I mean by that is, like, when you think about, some past hurt and, maybe past guilt and shame and past insecurities or some things that cause some insecurities in your life. And kind of the way anger works is like you have these unresolved heart issues from your past that haven't been dealt with. You haven't really worked through those issues with the Lord. And all of a sudden something triggers that in present day. Something triggers the hurt from the past. And next thing you know, your heart, it starts boiling with this rage. And it's almost like a protective mechanism we have, where we're trying to avoid going back that direction. And so what we do is we project this anger and we project this rage. And the more I've thought through that, I think I've noticed that in my life is the times that I start to get angry is because some things have been unresolved in the past, and I can trace it back there if I do the hard work to actually trace it back there. And I think another source where anger can really come from is just to be honest, sinful tendencies that we have. And so if you have some sinful tendencies of being prideful, and some people come at you and kind of chip away at your pride a little bit, what's going to happen is anger is going to come out, because it's working against the sinful tendencies that you have. And other sinful tendencies, like if you have a bent towards jealousy and envy and those type things, it's easy to look at other people's life and you have this jealousy and envy and those type things, and then you just get mad, you get angry because you see all the stuff that you don't have, and that anger is rooted in the sinful tendencies. And so I think those are the two sources. Like when we really think about anger and we think about rage, it really kind of traces back to a heart issue. And one of them is like the unresolved things that we dealt with in our past. When they're left unresolved, you're going to have this fight or flight, this protective mechanism that's going to result in anger when those things get triggered. The other thing is, the other source of anger is probably just those sinful tendencies, and it exposes all of that. So this is something that we can all try. Something I'm personally going to try is next time I sense in my heart and my spirit that anger is starting to come out and I'm starting to get mad, I'm starting to get frustrated, and I would just want to lash out, which isn't really in my nature, but when this anger is starting to kind of boil and those type things, my challenge is just to pause and to ask a question like, where is this anger coming from? And do the hard work. Really trace it back to the source, because I think you might be surprised where it's actually coming from. And in Proverbs 14, verse 29, it talks about how the person that's slow to anger, and this is kind of the Message version, I love it. It's like the person that's slow to anger has great understanding. And so what it's saying here, if you don't get angry quick, then you can actually understand the situation at hand. And that's so cool. But then it also goes on to say that, the person that's quick to anger and just automatically gets mad stockpiles stupidity. And I thought that was a great way to kind of put this in perspective, that if you're slow to anger, you'll have great wisdom. and great understanding. You'll be able to kind of see the big picture. But if you're quick to anger, you're just going to stockpile stupidity in your life. And I think we've all been able to sense that. And so, for me, it really just kind of boils back to a heart issue. And that's the root of anger. And it's definitely not a fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. I think all of those are counterintuitive to anger. And so we definitely know that anger is not from God. And it's a heart issue. So yeah, anger.
Man, forgiveness. It's this amazing thing to receive, but it's even better to give. And what do I mean by that? Like, I think we could talk about it even like not on a spiritual level, but just like a physical, tangible level. I mean, people who have learned how to forgive well have lower levels of anxiety and depression. Now, for me, that's two things that I'd be very willing to give away and get rid of. I think that's true for everybody. People that forgive well, we see in studies that they have higher brain functions and their digestive system works better. Those are two things you'd really kind of want to work out pretty well, right? But, for people that have this banner of Jesus is King above their life, that they say, hey, I'm a believer, I'm a follower of Christ. What does forgiveness mean for them? What does that mean for me? I think, Jesus writes that out well when he talks about how, to be a believer, it's a cornerstone of your walk with Jesus is to be able to forgive well. Forgiveness is just something that is a part of what it is. It's a part of the Christian DNA. And, Jesus talks about it over and over again. This one time he's talking about, how to handle, conflict among your brothers, like how two men have conflict, how to come to resolution. And we see that that's Jesus's will for conflict is resolution. And, Peter comes up and he has this concern that I think a lot of people do, like forgiving people, like how much is too much? And he walks up to Jesus in this moment. He says, well, like, Jesus, how many times should we forgive our brother? And he gives this answer that he thinks is going to be very spiritual and really powerful. And he asks Jesus, like, 7 times? And Jesus says, no, man, it's like 7 times 70 or 77. Like, it's a bunch. Like, more than you could ever fathom is how many times we need to forgive. And he explains that through a story of the parable of the good king and like the servant that comes in, and the servant's like accrued all this debt. And it's like this amount of debt that's just unfathomable. It's like, how do you it's like the national debt, like this one person incurred like the national debt. It's like, how did you do that? How is that even possible? But he has this massive debt, and the king looks at him and says, hey man, it's okay. I'll cover it. Go. And that servant, he goes and he goes to live his life. But instead of showing that same forgiveness that he was shown, he sees that guy on the street that owes him some money. And he owes him like a sizable amount of money, but not even close to what he owed the king. But he goes, and instead of showing him grace and saying, hey man, I've been shown grace and forgiveness, I'm going to show that to you. And instead he does the obvious next step, and he grabs him by the throat and he throws him in jail, right? Like, that's not exactly the same exact instance that he saw. That's not the exact same, decision-making that he saw in front of the king. And so he takes this guy to jail, he throws him in jail, and the king hears about it and brings him back in front of him. And he's like, man, you just don't get it. And like to receive this amount of forgiveness and this amount of grace, like for you to get that, you are called to show it. And Jesus uses that parable to explain, like, for you to say that you're a believer and a follower of Christ, and like that means you're called to show forgiveness. That means you're called to live different than the rest of the world. And really what we're called to do is to look at when other people do us wrong and hurt us. Man, we're not called to anger, but instead we're called to forgive, and we're called to look at what they've done to us through the prism of the cross. It's called to look at that situation, that moment where you feel hurt, you feel injured. It's not to minimize it. No, it's not that, but instead it's to realize, yes, like you've messed up and you've hurt me, but I've messed up and I've hurt people and I've messed up and I've hurt God and I've sinned against God. And in his reaction to my sin and my debt wasn't to condemn and hurt. No, it was to forgive and love. And we see that manifested in the cross. And that we incurred a debt, a sin debt. But instead of Jesus saying, well, all right, well, I guess I'll find someone else that's better. No, he didn't do that. He looked at you in your hurt and your mess. And he said, you're worth paying the price. And that's so powerful that Jesus comes into that moment. He sees that debt, and somebody has to pay the debt. And he just doesn't let us try to cover it. No, instead, Jesus comes in and he says, I got it. and he uses the cross as payment for all of our sin and all of our shortcomings. He steps in that gap. And he says, I'm going to pay the price and I'll forgive you. And as believers, once we're able to kind of see that and realize the magnitude of that, of how powerful it is that what had to happen for us to be forgiven, it makes it a little bit easier to look at other people around us and say, hey, like, instead of me trying to hold on to this and hold this over you, instead I'm going to let go and forgive, because my sins have been forgiven and my shortcomings have been forgiven. Because I get grace, I can give grace. And that's the power of forgiveness. Yeah, man. So Timmy, how do you handle when you're angry at me? How do you figure that out?
Where are we starting? So we've been, kind of talking about anger, and, anger is this thing that we all deal with, we all struggle with, but it's interesting because, not a lot of us have really ever paid attention to where anger comes from. Yeah. We just see the end result, when we get mad, like we destroy people, and so just kind of like thinking through anger and where it comes from. I think one spot it comes from, is just like this, like unresolved issues from our past. It could be with a person, it could be with a situation that happened or whatever. So, I want us to just kind of think about it in the sense of like, let's just take a scenario, and I'd love your thoughts on how forgiveness plays into this. Is like, so I got really mad at someone, or someone did something to me, hurt me, and it, more than just surface level, like it scarred to some degree, right? And I never really took that to the Lord. So there's this unresolved issue in my past. Now something triggers that unresolved issue, and I'm starting to get mad. I'm starting to get frustrated, and I'm frustrated at whoever, whoever's in my way. And how does how does forgiveness play a role in all of that? Yeah,
man. I think you did like that in your talk when you're talking about, finding these roots and like what kind of draws anger out and what like the cause of it. I think that's something that we don't really talk about. We don't really think about, but I think it's really important, like how anger and forgiveness kind of coincide and how they each kind of play off of each other. I think that's huge because, I think, we're creatures that enjoy control. Like we like to know what we're doing. We like to know that we're not being manipulated. We like to know we like to control our next step. And so I think where anger it kind of comes from, and resentment and kind of withholding forgiveness, we kind of have this disillusion that that's what forgiveness is like, I'm not going to give this to you, because that way I have control over this. Like I may not have control over what you did to me, but I have control over forgiving you, and I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to give that. But we ultimately see that we don't actually end up having control over that, but instead it has control over us. And that's kind of one of those roots that causes that anger. Is it doesn't make you a better person, but instead it makes you bitter.
That's really good. So like forgiveness in some sense is, yes, you're like forgiving someone, but the way forgiveness kind of plays into all of this is it's not just freeing them from what they've done, but forgiveness, kind of what you're saying, it actually frees you.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's awesome.
That's crazy. Sure. Crazy to think about.
Yeah. And so like that, forgiveness we see, like it's kind of we see over and over in the Bible, like where Jesus talks about resolution, that amongst his people, he wants like unity, he wants cohesion, he wants us to move in one direction. And we see that like anger is one of those things that divides that, and that,
it's very divisive.
Yeah. And it can't really, forgiveness is something that unifies, and it's unifies not because you're just like, hey, I'm cool with whatever you did, don't worry about it. But instead it's like, hey, like I realize what you did, but I'm able to forgive that. So you're able to when you're able to kind of forgive other people, it's whenever you're able kind of.
I'm kind of putting you on a spot because I'm just not thinking of this. Didn't like C.S. Lewis? He had a quote. Wasn't it him?
Something like that.
It was like, once you see that God's forgiven you of the unforgivable, then you can forgive. It was something. I butchered it.
Yeah,
it was something
like that. But yeah, pretty much. I mean, you can't like. It's one of those things that, you hear it all the time. Like, once you get it, you can give it. Like once you understand like the magnitude of like what forgiveness has done for you and how freeing that is for you, you're able to give it to other people because you're able to kind of, weigh it out. Like, this is something that sets me free.
Well, last thing, because one thing you said that caught my attention. You said those who forgive, their digestive tract is better. Is there a correlation here?
Yeah, I'm a very bitter person. No, like that's. I remember reading that study, and I had to address some things in my life. I'm like, man, I must really hate some people. I must have some grudges going on.
I have to like second guess every time the systems aren't working. Like, am I not forgiving somebody?
I mean, but really, it's really cool to see that correlation of kind of being like, hey, like, it's not just something that's good emotionally, but no, there's physical ramifications for not being a forgiving person. And so, hey, next time your brain's not functioning right, you need to be like, what's happened? Who am I angry at right now?
Yeah, I like it. So anger and forgiveness, they go hand in hand. That's really cool.
For sure. So pooping, am I right?